Okay, cool. So I'll also introduce myself. My name is Claudia. I'm a program assistant here at Building 21. And in my free time, I'm a PhD student in linguistics. And I study figurative language. But as some of you know, I also have an acute interest in some of the challenges that humanity is facing currently, especially climate change. So maybe just as a preamble and to sort of refresh our minds, I'm going to say a word or two about today's topic. Without diving too much in the details, we know that one of the problems with economical growth, at least recently, is that it has brought upon our environment a series of destructive consequences, so that producing and consuming more does not seem to be the way to go. And in recent years, the term degrowth has acquired a certain popularity. Simply put, degrowth means decreasing our gross domestic product, or GDP. And this could be bad. It could cause economic recessions, and it could also bring upon us a series of distributional problems. So the people who would be the most affected by degrowth would be the socioeconomic classes with a lower income in society. And now, Peter, who is here with us, you wrote a book on this topic, Managing Without Growth, and you've also worked on a series of related topics like the circular economy. But most notably for what we're here today, Peter, you worked on a computer simulation model called Low-Grow SFC, which ran diverse scenarios for the Canadian economy, including various degrowth scenarios, some of which were more promising than others. So I'm going to leave the stage to Peter now, and maybe you can tell us a bit about your model and research. And you need to be able to share screen. So maybe Olivier, you can do that.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Done. It's done.
Cool.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for those introductions. It really helps to know something about who's speaking together today. About myself, just to begin with, I do have a strong training in economics. My undergraduate and PhD were both very much in economics, but I was already getting interested in environment and economics, or environment and economy, back in the 1960s when I did my PhD. And so that marked my career. And I've spent years as an academic, but also as a public servant on 2 occasions in the Ontario Ministry of the Environment. So I've seen government processes from the inside, and I ran a consulting company for many years. So I had a long career, but the last 20 years or so I've been back in academia, working on these questions relating to growth. I was really surprised when I received the email from Claudia expressing interest in my computer model. And so it really caught my attention, and I should congratulate her in front of everybody else on the lovely email that she wrote me in right away. And I said, yes, sure, I'll come and talk with your group, and that sounds like fun. And then I offered, I think, to do a short introduction on the model, and then we'll see where the discussion goes from there. So now I realize that your backgrounds are very different, and so I will try to explain things as clearly as I can, but if I don't, then you must let me know and I'll try again. But so I have a few slides, about a dozen slides to go through, about 20 minutes or so, and then we can open it up for discussion. So I have to say, specifically what I'm going to try to do now is to explain a little bit why I built the model and what it's for, and some of the results that we get from it. So I can let me see, to share the screen. Can you see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, now I've used your title for the talk. It's really not mine. That's Can We Regulate Ourselves Out of the Climate Crisis? What I'm going to talk about is an overview of the model. I'll explain the name. Well, the low grow part is pretty clear. It is designed to investigate what happens in an economy, or what could happen in an economy that's not growing fast. Could it in fact be showing what you're calling degrowth? And the SFC I'll explain in a minute. So these are the 2 characters. about 10, 12 years ago, sitting down somewhere in southern Britain. We'd become friends. This is Tim Jackson. If you haven't encountered his work, I highly recommend it. He wrote a book called Prosperity Without Growth about the same time as I was working on managing without growth, and we crossed paths and decided to collaborate. And so Low Grow SFC is a joint output from both of us. So this image here is designed to say what most economists spend most of their time working on, what we call the real economy, where land, labor, and capital are put together in one way or another to produce the goods and services that we consume. That's sort of the bread and butter of mainstream economics. What it doesn't tell us is, where do the resources come from that make this system possible, and where do the wastes go to that are inevitably produced when you start using material things? You don't literally consume them. You change their form, get some value out of them, but ultimately they get discarded from the economy back into the environment. And that is what ecological economics, the subdiscipline, or it's not really the alternative way of doing economics that I've worked on for many years, where we focus on energy and materials and life itself, and how that relates, the biological life, how that relates to the real economy. And when I first on my own started modeling with Low Grow, that's what I wanted to capture, these linkages between the natural world and what we call the economy. But at the same time, a wholly different group of economists were rethinking finance. And for a couple of reasons. First of all, finance didn't really enter the analysis of the real economy except as a peripheral issue until till the financial recession in the late, about 2008, 2009, when economists woke up and said, oops, we've kind of overlooked finance. Well, the people working on what is now known as modern money theory had been giving it a lot of thought for a few decades. And but they don't pay attention to nature. They're very good insights on how finance works in relation to the real economy, the banking system, the role of the central bank, how credit is created, how money is created, and so on, but with no idea about how it links to the natural world. So Tim and I decided that we had to try and put all three of these dimensions together in one interrelated framework, so that we could say when something happens in one element, what might the repercussions be somewhere else. So that's the broad framework of ecological macroeconomics. And the computer model I'm about to describe is an attempt to go beyond just a nice graphic. Well, I think it's a nice graphic, but a graphic like this, and allow us to do some quantitative analysis and scenario investigations and so on. But before I describe the model, I want to use this image to show that on the one hand we have the real world, this little boy looking out at the real world, and on the other we have a computer model. And the model is not the world. There's way more left out of any model, no matter how good it is, than is in the real world. And part of the art of model building is to work out what you need to include in your model to help you understand some aspects of the real world, to help you ask new questions and get some answers. Now, I say this always as a reminder to myself, because you can get mentally trapped by these models and think that you somehow captured everything when, of course, you haven't. And just as a little anecdote, I showed this slide some years ago at a public event in the States, and a lady came up to me afterwards and asked me where I got the slide from. And I said, well, I got it from the internet. She said, well, that's my son. 20 years ago. He's grown up to be one of the world's leading exponents of computer modeling. I'm just going to move images here. So this is a schematic of Low Grow, and you'll see there I've summarized the purpose of the model: to explore alternative possible futures encompassing economic, social, and environmental considerations. And the model consists of a group of components, submodels. So here's one. This is where we capture what I've called the sort of the bread and butter of economics, the conversion of the land, labor, and capital. By capital, I don't just mean money. I mean things like factories and machinery and software, the things that people work with in order to produce output. So that's there. That's very important. We have this financial submodel. So finance is very much in the model. Now I'll explain that SFC. It stands for stock flow consistent. Maybe it doesn't explain anything, but what it's meant to convey is that in our model, we ensure that every expenditure is also somebody's income. And when you spend some money on something, that becomes their income. And in any economy, those two things should balance. The same thing is true of a debt and credit. If somebody has a debt, then somebody else or some other institution has a credit. These have to balance by definition. Now, you'd think that's kind of obvious, but unless you build that into your model, you've no guarantee that what your model is telling you is in any way realistic in terms of these financial dimensions. So that's a very important thing to have in a model of the whole economy, that it be stock flow consistent. And this comes out of that modern money theory that I was telling you about before. Because looking into the future, the general consensus, well, there's always exceptions, is that we're talking about an electrical future, finding other ways to generate electricity, solar, wind, and so on, and using that electricity for things that we currently use fossil fuels for. So we've thought it was important to pull out of our real economy, particularly the electrical model, electricity sector. So we'd look at this transition from fossil fuels to generating electricity from renewable sources. Green investment's very important if we're going to make a transition to an economy that places less or even reduced pressure on the planet. So what is green investment? Well, green investment is investment where the primary objective is to reduce environmental impact. Now, it can be profitable, but it might not be. But its primary objective is environmental, whereas conventional investment, even if it has some green benefit, is intended primarily for profit. So that we wanted to bring that out so that we could examine that in some detail. Now we also have an environmental submodel, which has two key components. And I noted, I'm sorry I forgot the name, but one of the people on this call is a physicist, wondering what on earth has physics got to do with economics? Well, from an ecological economics point of view, it has everything to do with economics, because, as I said a moment ago, when you use materials, as you would know from the law of conservation of mass, the mass is conserved, but it gets converted from, in an economic sense, from useful materials to waste. Now, it can get recycled and reused, stay in the economy longer, but everything that you do to it generally degrades it, and it gets disposed of as waste. So in this model, we track that. Well, you don't do that normally. And we also use this thing called the ecological footprint that you may have heard of, which is, again, a physical measure of the pressure that human activity puts on the biosphere. So these are in the model too. And finally, well, you have a model, but how's the whole system doing? We call that the performance metrics. So we have the standard ones like GDP, we have environmental like the ecological footprint, and we have a broader index of sustainable prosperity, which encompasses a lot of different things. So that, I hope, gives you sort of the flavor, the scope of the model. So what makes this model different from thousands of other computer models that are out there? I'm just going to give you a list of them. We use something called system dynamics. Now, system dynamics, and that diagram, that little boy, was a systems dynamics diagram. If you want to try your hand at modeling, I highly recommend you go to system dynamics. It's dead easy to use. They teach it in the low grades in schools in parts of the US. It's not difficult. I taught it myself, which was a neither here nor there, but you don't actually have to take classes in it to learn it. The model has this materials balance requirement. Materials are tracked through the economic system. And we then can see, when we make a change in the economy, what's it doing in terms of materials that are being thrown out as waste. We have the ecological footprint. It's stock flow consistent, so the money balance is always checked. The debts and credits always have to balance. Now, when we say something's endogenous, we say what that means in modeling language is that it's calculated within the model. So I, as the operator of the model, don't say how much money there is in the economy. The model does that. It does it through the banking system. When you go to a bank to borrow money, the bank doesn't lend you somebody else's money. The bank usually doesn't nowadays take cash out of the till and give it to you. It makes an entry into a computer, and it puts some money into your computer account, and it makes an equivalent note in its own computer account saying now you owe that money. And that money was just created through that act of lending. So money is endogenous. It's created when loans are made. Electricity planning and operations are determined within the model, are also endogenous. The model looks ahead to say how much new electrical capacity will be required according to how much demand the model says will likely to be required. And then it allocates that investment to renewables and non-renewables depending upon their relative costs. The productivity of labor, you hear a lot about that in the press. They're always complaining that Canadians have a lower labor productivity than Americans. What they mean by that is the amount of goods and services on average produced by a Canadian employee is less than their American equivalent. That's what we mean by labor productivity. In this model, labor productivity is the result of other things. It's not just, we don't just say, well, let's suppose labor productivity is X or Y. The model calculates that. The hours worked, these vary according to different things. And again, that's endogenous in the model. If unemployment goes up, the model has within it the capacity to say, therefore, average time spent at work is likely to go down if there's more unemployment. Green investment, I've mentioned that. I won't do it again. And I think got one more. Can't see it on my screen because I don't know, never really mastered these figures. Oh yes, the model's empirically based. There's a lot of data about Canada in the model. It's not just a theoretical mathematical exercise. It's based upon data. But that's a long list of things that, but it's only some of the distinctive features, but they're the key ones. Now, to get to some scenarios. We have something called a base case, which is what would likely happen if current policies stayed in place and current trends and relationships. By relationships, I mean there's an assumed, well, it's estimated actually, but let's say an assumed relationship between what happens if people get more money, how they'll spend it. Will they spend it or save it, or how will they divide it between spending and saving? That's what we mean by a relationship. And if current trends, policies, and relationships are maintained, the model then spits out some outcomes. I've called this the second one, the escape scenario, because it's actually taken from a book that I'm just finishing, which is called Escape from Overshoot. Overshoot being the fact, I think, that humanity has overshot the capacity of the planet to support us on an ongoing basis. So how are we going to escape from that? That's the book. But for that book, I produced an escape scenario. You could call a degrowth scenario. It is in some important respects, and I'll show in a moment. Well, I'll have, just so you could get an understanding of this escape path, if it would mean that we would see a much higher price on carbon emissions from electricity generation. And what that does, of course, it then shifts the preference for the generators, the electricity companies, to going to renewables. So that's the way, a way to do that. We impose a rapid electrification of road and rail transportation. We have all the other sectors in the economy doing what needs to be done to get to net zero carbon emissions. That's very much tied to this switch from brown to green investment. In terms of inequality, this scenario includes quite a significant redistribution of income to people at the lower end of the income distribution. And it sort of reduces poverty and reduces income inequality. We have a number of what are now called circular economy measures to specifically reduce materials flowing through the economy. And the model takes Statistics Canada's low population forecast, which has the population of Canada stabilizing by mid-century. So a lot of things that are different from just continuing on as we are doing it at the moment. So going to have to show you some graphs now to see the difference between the base case and the escape scenario. I'll show you these one at a time. I hope they're small, but I hope you can see them. Starting off with the environmental flows. The solid line is the base case, and you can see this is 2 billion tons virtually of waste produced in Canada each year. I think that's 2,000 megatons, rising steadily into the future. But in the escape scenario, you see how we are getting degrowth in the most important sense of the term. We are reducing the physical size of the economy. So that's one indicator, environmental, and here's the ecological footprint. Basically, it goes up fairly slowly to begin with because of all the climate reduction measures that we're seeing in place already. But once they're in place, what happens with growth is you just carry on back this way. Whereas with the escape scenario, we reduce our ecological footprint by more than 50%. Greenhouse gas emissions are coming down if the government's plan works out quite significantly. I don't believe they'll get us to net zero, but there is a net zero possibility with more green investment than the government has planned at the moment. Here's electricity from renewables. You see, it rises significantly even in the base case. But we have to do more than that if we really want to reduce the environmental impact of our economy. You can get up to 100% with sufficient investment in it. Here's the unemployment rate. Now, here the story is not quite as good as I would like it, but nonetheless, you learn from these models. You don't just tell them what you want to get and get it. So basically, the message from this is that the unemployment rate stays roughly around 6% in both scenarios. But if anything, it's better off. You're better off with that extra growth than in the escape scenario. But I think the difference is actually quite modest. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. The standard way of measuring, the inequality in the income distribution is something called the Gini coefficient. I don't need to explain that to you, but it varies between 0 and 1. And if it's 0, it means that income is perfectly equally distributed in an economy. And if it's, I've got to get that right. If it's 0, sorry, it's perfectly evenly distributed. If it's 1, then everything is going to one person. So in the escape scenario, because we're redistributing income every year up to it's about 60 billion a year, I think, in this scenario, we get a decline in this Gini coefficient. That's not insignificant. So we're reducing inequality. More results. Well, here's GDP. I put this way down my list for various reasons, but this is what matters so much to so many people: politicians, business people, ordinary people, economic students. So the base case, you get lots of GDP growth. In the escape case, we stabilize GDP in this scenario. So we're getting a decline in the physical scale of the economy and stabilizing GDP, which, by the way, means our GDP would be even bigger than it is now, just a bit, but it doesn't keep growing. Economists pay a lot of attention to this government debt to GDP ratio. In other words, how much is the government borrowing in relation to how big is the economy? And in the base case, it comes down a little bit. And in the escape case, it rises somewhat, but it doesn't keep rising after this point. But you can't tell that from this graph, but I've run it beyond here. This percentage, by the way, is not particularly high. In Japan, they went up to over 200%. and the economy didn't crash. It didn't grow very fast. It didn't crash. So one can argue about how significant that difference is, but anyway, it's there. On the other hand, on the escape scenario, household debt to the value of the assets, the net worth of households begins to decline, whereas in the base case, it continues to rise. The reason it declines is because there's lower consumption, so there's lower consumer debt. And so from that point of view, you could say that's an advantage. But finally, still with me, this is a little tricky to understand. This is, we divide the economy up into the public sector, that's all government, and everything else is the private sector. In the base case, the private sector's net lending, it's lending money, and if it's lending money, someone's borrowing it. The only players that are left is the government, so the government's borrowing the money. So in this scenario, the private sector keeps lending, and the public sector keeps borrowing. So even though the debt to GDP ratio is falling, government, in fact, is borrowing more and more money every year and hoping that that's not a problem because of the economic growth. In the escape scenario, this is rather different. Private sector lending, apart from this bump here, keeps declining. By the end of the run, there's no net lending or borrowing between the two sectors. There's borrowing and lending within the private sector, from one private sector component to another, banks to businesses, for example, but not between the public sector and the private sector. And so I come to the end.
All right.
Thank you, Peter. That was a very, I feel like you vulgarized a lot of this to make it as graspable for us. I don't know if there are maybe any questions about the slides themselves or things that weren't clear. So I would maybe open the floor for that.
Oh, there are plenty of questions.
Yeah, perfect then. I also have some, but I can keep mine for the end or for later. So please go ahead.
I'll ask the first one. Thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. I have tons of questions, but one is most on my mind. Part of your model is based on electrification. Now, most of it is still, I know, so your model is based on Canada, I guess, but across the world, most electricity is still produced by coal and other sources of energy. So how do we solve that problem? Because, tell me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that the little I read on this thing is that electrification, the need for electricity will increase, which means that I'm not sure if renewable are enough, which means eventually, and I may be wrong, eventually we'll also have to use more nuclear energy. So here's my question to you. So how do we solve that sort of conundrum of more electricity?
Okay. I thought I was being overly ambitious to try to see how Canada could move forward in a responsible way by reducing its impact on the biosphere and thereby setting an example, perhaps, to others to follow. Right now, we set a very different kind of example. We said, well, you heard it from, it's from the British Prime Minister, growth, growth, growth. Those are her priorities. So that's the example that countries like Canada, the UK, US are setting. But your question, in a way, says, well, I actually haven't been ambitious enough, that I've got to answer the questions for countries in very different circumstances. And although I've got things to say about that, I have some experience working in developing countries, I just haven't done the work. So I'm not trying to duck your question, but it's really, well, it's beyond the scope of what I just presented. Now, there is an ancillary question, though, and that is, well, what happens if only Canada does what I've sort of described and other countries don't? You get very different outcomes. And if other developed countries, if I can use that language, were to also adopt something like that escape path, then it would work out much better for everybody than if one country tries to go it alone. It's not that you can't do it, but the challenges are greater. But as for electrifying on a grand scale, I was looking at a couple of studies recently. There's quite a dispute about whether global electrification is a viable way forward for all countries based upon renewables. You see, the problem with renewables, and it's captured in the model to some extent, is the energy is renewable, the solar energy is renewable, the wind energy is renewable, but you need materials to capture them. You need to build photovoltaic collectors and wind turbines. And when you start building these things on a scale that's transforming your electric power system, just even thinking of Canada, then the amount of materials becomes quite prodigious. And in that overall in the model, you do get a reduction in material use, but in the electric power sector, no, it's very material intensive. So these are all complications. But I've just done the best I could, well, with Tim, to scope it out for Canada. And by the way, other people pick up this kind of modeling approach in other countries and are onto me to adapt the model there and so on. So it's not all. So I'll just leave it there. We want to come back to implications for developing countries. We can do so, but perhaps not.
Thank you.
Anita.
Well, first, thank you. Thank you very much to Claudia for bringing me here. Of course, maybe not obviously, but I'm really interested now to read one of your papers and to know more about the details of your model. So I think my question might be very simple, but it occurred to me when I saw your graph, and I'm sure that you explaining it might help me a little bit. But at the point where you'd shown that, I mean, obviously for degrowth, GDP has to go down, but what's the implication of this on progress in a very broad sense, like developing a new electricity or something?
Yeah. In that scenario I showed you, GDP doesn't go down, it levels off.
Ah, okay.
It goes up more slowly and then it plateaus.
Okay, I thought I had seen the dotted line go down. I was wrong?
Not on that graph. There were dotted lines that go down. On materials goes down, the ecological footprint goes down, but the GDP levels off.
Ah, and so then what does leveling off imply for progress? I guess my idea is just, we're always going to try to find some new invention or create some new form of energy or something that's going to get us out of this mess. And does that affect our ability to create new things?
Okay, there's so many things in your question. We have to start from what do we mean by progress? Progress used to be a broadly understood term to encompass moral progress, ethical progress. You can have progress in gender relations. You can have progress in so many dimensions. However, in this day and age, we've come to think of progress as little more than economic growth. If our economy is growing, that is progress. Well, that's such a mistake, because your economy can grow and yet many people can become poor. The environment can get destroyed. It's just we've got to separate those ideas. So that will be part of my response to your question, that progress is a much richer concept than just economic growth. So there's no reason, therefore, to think automatically that if we don't have economic growth, we can't have progress where it really matters. In fact, some people argue economic growth stands in the way of progress in the other dimensions. Okay, now we need technological progress, technological innovation in an escape scenario, in a degrowth scenario, just as much as we need it in a growth scenario, but the difference is in the kind of innovation that we need. So we need innovation that's going to specifically reduce material and energy requirements, not as a side effect, not as a nice to have if we can have it, but as a fundamental requirement. I'd add another one in there. I've been very concerned about biodiversity loss, which is largely due to habitat destruction. Well, we've got to stop destroying the habitat of the other species that we share the planet with. So we need to focus our policies, in my view, on those sorts of targets much more explicitly, and not thinking that if we have economic growth, we'll be rich enough that we can then deal with those problems. I've been around long enough to know that that's what we heard 50 years ago. If I'd been told, or if people 50 years ago had been told that the Canadian economy is going to be 4 times as big in 2022 than it is today, people say, well, fantastic. all the problems will go away. And it's just not true. So, so what this says is that we must think more explicitly about what it is we want to achieve. In other words, to use the well-being language that's now becoming quite popular, there's the Well-Being Economy Alliance, which if you haven't sought out, I highly recommend. It's an alliance of all sorts of different groups and organizations, and now some countries, interestingly enough, which are joining this Well-Being Economy Alliance. Now we've got to restructure our economies around the pursuit of well-being. And well-being is a much more flexible, much more inclusive term than economic growth. So there's so much we can say about that. If the other thing, just one more comment. Degrowth is not the same as recession or depression. Degrowth is not about the collapse of economies. Until very recently, and even now, I hesitate to use the term degrowth because in the English language, as you well know, it has a very negative connotation. I understand that the French décroissance, that it's a translation of, has a richer meaning, but I don't grasp that because I don't speak French, and I apologize for that. I forget my train of thought, but anyway, yes, so the well-being language, the degrowth pursuit is all about enriching people's lives. The donut economy, it's another one that's captured attention. It's all about different ways of enriching people's lives, so that we really need to rethink the meaning of progress, set aside economic growth as some kind of easy way of solving problems, because it creates as many as it solves, if not more, in a rich country like this. And then we may be able to get somewhere.
Can I just say that was a fantastic answer? Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Oh, Jill, I thought you were raising your hand. Good. Yeah, please go ahead, Milena.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for your very interesting presentation. Please excuse me if my question is a bit out of topic, so don't hesitate to just bring me back if ever it is a bit out of topic. So maybe two parts of the question. Firstly, I feel like the low growth / degrowth model questions a lot the notion of development in itself. And I would be interested to have your thoughts on how this model will be implemented or applied differently to so-called developed countries and developing countries. So maybe that would be the first part of your question. And after that, I would like also to question you about foreign aid given to developing countries, since a huge part of programs that are aiming to eradicate poverty are focusing a lot on developing the economy of poorer countries. So I'm thinking, for example, about social programs funded mainly by countries from the global north. So what place would take, for example, cash transfers or any social programs that are aiming to develop economy? What place would have these types of things in a low growth / degrow model?
Right. Well, as I'm sure you realize, there's an awful lot wound up in your questions. First was probably the easier of the two. How do you apply this kind of model to a developing country? Well, you'd have to change the structure of the model somewhat, although it's fairly generic. So we have banks, for example. They have banks in developing countries, and they also create money when they lend it, just like the banks here. But the banking system, you also have a lot more shadow banking, informal banking, other kinds of financial arrangements that we don't use that much here. So that's just an example of how you'd want to redesign the way the money system is represented in the model. And that's, I don't have wood fuel as one of the fuels in the Canadian economy, in the Canadian model. I did spend a couple of years as a renewable energy advisor in Kenya a long time ago. 70% of the energy came from wood. Clearly, if you're going to apply this model, Kenya, you'd have to have the wood fuel sector, which means you want the forests to be modeled explicitly. So you'd really be talking about a new model that you could learn something from Logro about. The thing about Logro, which I do think is relevant, is the name of the model really reveals its purpose. Its purpose was to help us understand what might be possible if we don't always look to economic growth as the solution to our problems. So so you'd have to ask yourself, what would be the purpose of building such a model in a developing country? It might be a different question, therefore it would generate a different model. You asked then about foreign aid to developing countries. This is a lot of people are very critical of foreign aid, not necessarily the idea of foreign aid, but how foreign aid is implemented in practice, where poor countries in fact become indebted to rich countries and find themselves in situations where they just can't repay the debt. And it may be because one politician did it because it seemed like a good idea at the time. They're no longer in power. They've either been removed democratically or by some other means, but it's now become somebody else's problem and they've got a horrendous debt. In comes the lender, which could be the World Bank, and starts saying, well, look, you've got to change the way you're running your economy. You know what you need? You need economic growth. And the best way to get that is to privatize this, that, and the other. And so that whole problem set can arise from foreign aid, and that's why it's often criticized. I'm a great believer, I suppose that's the way I have to describe it, in south-to-south assistance, not north-south. When I see countries at a different stage of development helping each other, I tend to think it's done because they have more common interests than when it's a rich country investing in a poor country. So, well, just like, from Britain, I can say Britain built the railroads around the world, but it wasn't philanthropic. It was an outlet for capital because there wasn't enough outlets for capital in Britain for them to make profits out of. So, as I say, your question raises a whole host of issues. But I will come back to one point, and I think it's only fair that I do this. If the GDP of a country is going to be lower in this escape scenario than it would otherwise be, then you would expect its capacity to give foreign aid to be less. And that may be an aspect that was troubling you. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much for your answers.
Yeah, I do find it is indeed very tricky trying to extend this model to countries which have which are different stages in their development and for whom it's not interesting at all at the moment to stop growing, right? I also had a question, but Zara, sorry, you can.
But there's also Viola here, so
okay.
Maybe you can give a list of questions. Who's first, second, third? That'll be easier.
Me?
Yeah.
Can I? Okay. So, instead I'll say my question since it's, and Zara, you can go afterwards. So, my question is just very general, also in relation to the title of this talk. Can we regulate our way out of the climate crisis? So, your model also predicts which kind of policies and offsetting policies might help us with, for example, distributional problems. So things like work sharing, for example. And my question is, are these kinds of policies things that we can contribute to bringing to fruition? Is it up to governments only? And more specifically, maybe what are some of these policies that you think are interesting?
Okay. It's a terrific question. I will try to answer it. I just want to go back to the previous one because I forgot to mention something that was actually on the slide. When I put up the two scenarios, I had a couple of graphics. One was an arrow sort of going, well, I had a jag in it, but it was going up. That's the growth one. But the other one, but I didn't explain it, had one line coming down and the other going up and the two meeting. Doesn't matter if you don't remember the image, but what part of my thinking is what's called contraction and convergence. In a material sense, if we are going to have a global population that can live in some sort of balance with the biosphere, then it's pretty clear that we can't do that if everybody tries to live at the material standard of living that Canadians have, or people in the US, or any of the OECD countries. These are the countries that have to undergo contraction in a physical sense. In other words, we've got to use less materials, less energy, and find a way of doing that that still gives us good lives. In the poorer countries, especially the poorest, there's still room for them to increase their material and energy consumption. And so over the long term, I think from an ethical point of view, we should be looking at contraction and convergence until eventually the world will be living more or less with equal and just standards of living around the world. We don't have to use these materials in the same way, but we should have some notion of fair share. So that I didn't include that in my description of low grow, but that's the sort of the broad picture that I have in my mind that relates the developing world to what we call the developed world. Now, as for regulation, one of the things that struck me when I read your title was that regulation has multiple meanings. You probably meant it to mean government regulation, but it doesn't have to mean that. I read it also as self-regulation. Can we regulate ourselves? And I believe that, and it's not just an individual thing, it's also done through groups. If you get involved with a group of sort of like-minded people, it doesn't matter whether that's a religious group or a group of philosophers or whatever, you can have a shared goal and you can move towards it. And through that, if it's to do with behavior change, you can self-regulate. And I believe that kind of regulation, as we've seen, I have to say, something that I never saw coming, kids in their, sometimes not even teenagers now, it's getting so young, out on the streets, talking about living their lives differently. I don't know if they'll succeed, but how refreshing to have them sort of say that what they're looking for is different from what they see their parents doing. And this is, I would say, part of self-regulation, simply not buying what the advertisers keep trying to sell us. Now, it would be a downside easier if advertising, taking that as an example, was regulated more. So that one of the things I would like to see in an advertising regulation is something along the lines that any product or service has to be shown how it is used in fact, at least 75% of the time. So instead of having car ads with the cars bright and shiny on top of a mountaintop, which they could never get to, as if that's what you're buying, they should show cars on the 401 near where I live in Toronto. It's a disaster. And I think if those were the ads, if you just required ads to be honest and defined what you meant by honest, could make a big difference. So you need regulation that's policy driven, but you also need, we need to regulate ourselves. Easier said than done, but we should try.
Thank you. Yeah, that does spark also a whole new set of questions. I would really like to hear what Zere, what you had in mind.
So first, thank you very much for the presentation. It's very useful. My question is actually related to human wellness index. As you previously mentioned that a lot of countries use this, and I know this, but for me, like I always have a question related to this index because I feel like it is a bit subjective measurement regarding the development and well-being. So an example could be like there's a country called Bhutan in the northwest of Indian border, as I remember. Like they, it is known as like the happiest country in the world with a very high human wellness index, but at the same time, it has very high unemployment rate and its GDP is very low. So in this case, would you say like in this kind of country, do they still need degrowth or it is a fact that they need this kind of economic growth instead of degrowth?
Well, you said something again, a very rich question. Any index, if it involves things that are not measured in the same way, require some subjective assessment of how the components are to be weighed together. So if you add, well, if you add educational achievement and health outcomes into an index, then someone, somehow, some group have to say how these two things compare. So when one goes up and the other goes down, and you want to say overall, though, we think things are getting better, you can't avoid those kind of subjective judgments. And GDP is no different. The aggregation or the summation of apples, oranges, visits to the hairdresser, doctors, all these things done in dollars, in terms of money units. And money units come out of, well, if they can get them, the market prices, whatever people are paying for them. And who gets to pay, who has more money gets to have more say in that system. And so if we have a Rolls Royce valued at, I don't know, $500,000, and you have, think of how many meals you can buy for $500,000. Well, GDP says they're equivalent. One Rolls Royce is worth however many meals for hungry people. Well, most people would never even agree to that, but that's what GDP tells us, because those money weights are embedded in the measurement. So there's no escape. This is a problem all the time. Now, when you come to Bhutan, I know a little bit about what they've done there. What they've basically said is, well, we want to judge our success differently from using just GDP. They called it the gross happiness. What do they call it? Gross happiness product, I think. Anyway, they wanted to be happiness. But then they have to say, okay, well, what contributes to happiness? Now, we normally think unemployment is a source of unhappiness, and it is, but it's a much less a source of unhappiness if you have a social security system, so that you're unemployed and you may not feel you're contributing to your society, but you're not starving. You've got food and you can afford to live. So the extent to which unemployment causes unhappiness depends upon the regulatory and social arrangements around it. And I'm just going to finish up by emphasizing again, I have to say this loudly and clearly, to me, degrowth has to focus on the physical dimensions of the economy. What happens to GDP is of less consequence. It's not saying we must make GDP smaller because that would be a good thing to do. It says we've got to make the physical size of the economy, the extent to which we're using materials of different kinds and converting land away from habitat and the things I've mentioned. We can make that smaller. Well, it probably will affect GDP. We'll handle that, but we'll have tackled the really big problems. I mean, look, you may very well be around to see a climate catastrophe, not just the unusual level of heating that we're seeing now, but something much more serious. If we destabilize the climate, it could be a calamity of unprecedented proportions, and it swamps completely any concern about GDP. Yeah, I mean, it's just so get things right in the right order. Do what needs to be done to stabilize the grand home that we share, we call planet Earth. And then within that, let's do the best we can. Don't think, well, if we just get growth, we'll always be able to solve those problems. That's such a mistake. Sorry if I go on a bit, but these are very important questions. And it saddens me to see in this day and age so much momentum still behind the traditional growth mantra.
So Viola has a question, Claudia. Maybe get a bit closer to the mic.
Yes, I was kind of along the lines of what you were just saying. I was wondering if you know where the idea that growth is necessary or what we want came from historically, because like I was, it probably has a lot to do with how I was raised, but it was kind of like, you know, just in terms of individual finances, you make as much as you need to get to like where you want to be, and then you just kind of stop because you don't need any more. So it seems logical that we would want that on a global scale, you know, just have as much as we need and then not want to go more. But it's true that the idea of growth being so important is kind of dominant in a lot of places, and I'm just wondering where that came from.
Well, the history isn't very complicated. If you go back to the 1930s, early 1930s, 1920s, what economists believed then was that unemployment really couldn't last because wages would go down if there was a lot of unemployment. People would often be prepared to work at lower wages, and if they were prepared to take lower wages, there'd be more jobs for them. That was sort of the basic idea. So there wasn't anything government, it was thought, there wasn't anything government could do or should do that the economy would sort itself out. Along comes the Great Depression in the 30s, where unemployment rose to 25% or more in many countries. And year after year, it wasn't sorting itself out. And then this wonderful economist, John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, had a completely different explanation on unemployment. He said if the reason there's unemployment is because people aren't spending enough money. And so he recommended governments to fill the gap. If the private sector was not prepared to spend the money, then government should spend the money. This was quite radical, though he wasn't a radical, but it was quite a radical idea. And you've probably heard of the New Deal in the US. Well, that was Roosevelt made that famous, and that was a sort of a form of Keynesian thinking. But what really, in a way, proved Keynes's point came with the Second World War. When governments, this is like I was saying before, when things are really bad, you don't worry about GDP. Governments spent money to fight that war. And unemployment disappeared, and economists became persuaded that the Keynesian account of unemployment was right. Now, you asked not about unemployment, you asked about growth. So what's the relationship? Well, the most volatile component of GDP, the part that sort of is hard to predict and fluctuates a lot, is investment expenditure, the decisions to build new buildings, buy new equipment, to expand your capacity. You only want to do that if you're running a business, if you think it's going to be profitable. And your view of that can change very quickly. And so investment, especially by the private sector, can fluctuate very much. And that causes instability in the economy. So Keynes said, government should come in with public investment, highways, rail systems, whatever, transportation systems, to balance it out, and also to be much more attentive to the disturbances that are affecting investment in the private sector. However, the problem comes, and this is where the growth story comes in. Other economists after Keynes, because he died in 46, began to realize that if investment is the key, and we've got a growing population and a growing labor force, we're going to have to keep investment increasing to keep unemployment low. But what do we mean? When we increase investment, we increase the capacity of the economy to produce. We've got more buildings, more infrastructure, more materials. It's all investment, right? So now we need, so the original idea was to have economic growth to give us full employment. Along comes the Cold War, and the two key economies, Russian or the USSR and the US, start competing over whose economy is going to grow faster, who's going to be able to build more rockets, more bombs, do the best for its people. And so growth itself became the objective, not full employment. And it's pretty much remained that way ever since. So that's the story. It's kind of an interesting story, and along with it went the development of GDP, because if the size of the economy mattered for dealing with unemployment, you better measure it. The size of the economy certainly mattered during the Second World War, and that's why the US and Britain in particular got very busy working out how to measure the size of the economy, and that's when GDP was invented. By the way, the primary inventor, an American called Simon Kuznets, spoke to a Senate committee in the US, 1934 or 37, I forget the date, explaining to them how to measure what he would call national income. It's the same thing. He said it's not a measure, shouldn't be understood as a measure of welfare. It shouldn't be used as a measure of well-being. He said it. And economists after economists today will tell you, oh, we know that. But you'd never know they know it.
Oh, thank you.
Follow-up?
Yeah, just so it's the idea of growth being so necessary is a relatively recent idea. If it's from like from the depression.
Oh, it's an addiction to growth. It's about 60 years or 70 years old. Yeah. Or the idea that there are things you could do about it. You used another term, I think, or you used a concept in your question, which I just want to highlight, the idea of sufficiency. Wouldn't it be nice if that was if we use that word more automatically? When is it sufficient? We don't have sufficient housing in Toronto. That's clear. Well, let's address that problem. We don't have sufficient food on everybody's plate, but a lot of people have more than what's sufficient. So it's a nice term. The word of enough. How about having enough?
Yeah.
That'd be nice in those terms.
What was your question?
No, I was also just wondering, do you know then what the kind of predominant, I don't know if model is the right word, but before, like in the 19th century, if everyone wasn't focused on growth the same way, do you know what was the focus?
Well, are you sure you want to go down that road? I mean, the person who's known as the father of economics is a guy called Adam Smith. And Adam Smith's book had a very long title, but it's known as The Wealth of Nations. And he wanted to try to understand why is it that some nations were wealthier than others. And it's it's a fantastic book, and you can go back that with 21st century eyes and get such a lot out of the book, the language, the concepts, and so on. And there's so much in there. He talked about the invisible hand, the market economy, how people produce things that other people want, and they know that because they can sell them. But he also talked about how business people will always get, whenever they get together, will try to collude and raise prices against the interests of people, and he had quite a strong role for government. It's quite, some people read that book and see it as a justification for a very heavy market emphasis, and others read it, no, he had a strong role for government. But it wasn't therefore government should do this to promote growth. It was more, here's how growth happens, and here are the things that can make it happen. Just underline a point I made before. He was not a professor of economics. He was a professor of moral philosophy, and he wrote a completely different book on the theory of moral sentiments. He wanted to understand why people had moral beliefs. And that whole side of Adam Smith is largely forgotten, but it mattered a lot to him. So it wasn't, as I said, it wasn't really until, it's hard to generalize. It wasn't really until the immediate post-war theory that theories of economic growth started getting published by economists. That doesn't mean that previously economists weren't thinking about economic growth. From a British economy point of view, in the 19th century, they wanted what was then free trade, so that because they were further ahead than anybody else in industrializing, they could produce things more cheaply than anyone else, and they didn't want other countries to have tariffs so that they could sell more. Well, this was a growth-oriented position. They didn't use that term necessarily. It's good for business.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll just go ahead if that's okay. I feel like my question relates a bit, but maybe not entirely. I think the topic of inequality and how our economies can either multiply them or like enhance inequality or not is very interesting. And we saw that in the escape scenario, inequality is reduced. And I was just wondering, how does that happen? And is it related to maybe limiting the scope of like big multinational companies? Because now, for example, we see that a lot of the money we spend maybe ultimately goes to a few people, which is why there's like a lot of discrepancy. And yeah, how does an escape scenario deal with that? Or what happens?
Okay. Well, the escape scenario only deals with it partly. It just says, look, the government in Canada already has what we call tax and transfer programs. Tax, we generally tax people with higher incomes. They pay a higher proportion of their income in tax. That's the way it's supposed to work. The tax law has got so complicated that there are ways that they can get around the intention of the tax system, if it is to tax people more the more they earn. But in the principles there, and it used to be more effective, progressive, we called it progressive income tax, where the tax rate got progressively higher the more income you earn, was used more than it is today. But that's there, that's available to us to use. The other part of that is the transfer part, where the money is taken from some people who pay the tax to the people who are poorer and get an income support in various ways. And we saw a lot of that during the worst days of COVID. So those instruments, we call them policies, are in place and can be used differently according to your orientation. But if we wanted to use them to achieve a more equal distribution of income, there's a lot that can be done using that. But income is only part of the story. We talk much less about wealth. Sometimes they're used synonymously, and that's a mistake. The right way to think about wealth is as a stock. If you've got $100,000 in the bank, you're wealthy. That's your wealth. Now that $100,000 could be producing interest for you. That interest is your income from that wealth. And so it's I do encourage you to keep those two concepts. They're related, but they're separate. So people who have a high income can accumulate wealth, can save it and build up the stock. Now, when you talk about multinational companies, these are tricky areas. Multinational companies can have widespread ownership. I mean, I have a pension through my university, and I'm sure some of that pension money is invested in multinationals, hopefully ones that are not behaving too badly. So I mean, I'm a part owner of who knows what. It's even hard to find out. And that's one of the things about pension funds. They invest people's money put aside for good purposes, so you can live after you retire, or you have an income after you retire, but that money sits somewhere. It's somebody's using that for some other purpose. So that's why you get all this disinvestment interest or disinvestment that's going on. So the point I want to make is, if we're really going to tackle inequality, we have to tackle inequality in the distribution of wealth, as well as inequality in the distribution of income. If you only tackle income, it will take ages for it to transform the distribution of wealth. So occasionally you get talk about a wealth tax. And some countries have wealth taxes, and they can be a tax on wealth that you have while you're alive, or a tax on wealth that you wish to pass on to your descendants, inheritance taxes, and on it goes. I mean, it's in this particular situation, getting clear in your mind what it is you'd like to achieve, what kind of economy you would like to live in, what kind of society you would like to live in, should be the first priority. And then working from there back to where we are now and say, okay, what do we have to change? So and it's a great exercise, and I think it's the sort of discussion probably goes on in this group more than in others, so it's good.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, you drew some very useful nuances and like distinctions as well, like between income and wealth, which I wasn't familiar with. I think Wei, you had your hand up before.
And I think this should be the last question, Claudia, because
Okay.
we have to let Peter go up at some point, because we could stay here till 4 o'clock this afternoon.
Yeah, I know. Never ends, really.
Wait, what's your question, Wait?
So first, thank you for your amazing presentation about degrowth. So
I just want to clarify a bit about my understanding of degrowth. So while I see the benefits of degrowth in developed countries, I also think there is a tight relationship between economic growth and the technology change and technology innovation. And technology change have impact our life a lot. So do you think degrowth will actually like restrict technology innovation, or does there any like impact of degrowth on technology innovation?
Right. So I'm going to give you a perspective that may answer your question. Because I've emphasized the physical dimension of the economy as being so important, because I think we've overshot the capacity of the planet to support us, we need to have regulation on the extent to which we extract materials and energy and convert land and produce waste. We need that. We have some regulations, but we don't have a comprehensive set which is effective enough to contain the physical size of our economies. Degrowth is very much about that, and it's about reducing that physical size. Now, if you were to have such limits, we can be pretty confident that the prices of the materials that we do extract would be higher than they are now, because the materials would be that much more scarce. Now, ask yourself the question, what would that likely do to technological development? It would make technological innovation of a sort that economized on these now more expensive materials and energy more profitable for the innovators and for the companies that innovate. And that's the kind of innovation that we need to get us out of the mess that we're in. So we definitely need innovation, but we need to guide it in a different direction. And that's one way of doing it. So a degrowth program of reduction in the physical scale of the economy is likely to stimulate technological innovation in a better direction than it's going now. And it won't be enough. We need also to regulate. I talked about regulating advertising. No point in saying we're going to make things scarcer, but we're going to keep telling you to go out and buy. That just makes people unhappy and frustrated. So we're talking about cultural changes as well as more conventional economic changes. But I'm sorry if you think that degrowth implies stagnant technology. That's not right. I talked a lot to most of the specialists in degrowth are located in Europe, in Barcelona in particular, and they defend the use of the degrowth word because it's deliberately provocative. They call it a missile word. They want to change people's thinking about the society we live in, the economy we have, what the good life means. And so they therefore want to attack what they think as a fundamental problem guiding us or leading us in a different direction and away from finding solutions. And that's this endless pursuit of growth. So whilst I don't like degrowth because you have to spend so much time explaining it, I do see its value. And then it gets us to talk about some of the right things. For the developing countries, to my mind, they need to think about what matters to them in a way that isn't just parroting or trying to follow the path that we followed, because it's not going to work for everybody. The planet can't stand it. We better do something else.
You have one more question? A small question. Okay.
Just in your model, you talked a lot about materials consumptions. What are the primary?
I can't hear the question.
Actually, I'll do it through my left.
No, because it's gonna be.
So I guess you talked a lot about. Is this better, volume-wise?
Sorry, what was that again?
It's better volume-wise.
Can someone?
Yes, it's better volume-wise.
Is that the? Sorry, everyone's got a muffled voice now. It must be my time is up. Just try it one more time.
So you talked a lot about materials consumption,
Yes.
What are the primary materials you're looking at in your model in terms of?
What is the material I'm looking at in the model? Okay, thank you for that. The materials are broken down into 4 categories. Fossil fuels is counted as a material because when when we thought about fossil fuel energy, but it enters the economy in material form. So fossil fuels are there, construction materials, non-ferrous metals. There's a 4th category, and I'm sorry, I've just lost track of them, but I followed the same categorization that's used in Europe by Eurostat. If this is a topic that interests you, I urge you to look at Eurostat. They have the best data on material use and the circularity of economies. They only look at the European economies. And when I was on the panel looking at the circularity of the Canadian economy for the Canadian Council of Academies, should happen to have the report here. It's online, it's free, called Turning Point. Can you see that? There we go. I'm sure it's in French too, if you prefer to read it in French. I built a model for them, for the panel, on the circularity of the Canadian economy, which I think the model's now online. It is, yes. And I used those 4 categories, and then I integrated that little model into Logro, which is why it now captures material flows in a way it didn't before.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was very interesting. Also, nice to hear how you've incorporated that into the new version of Logro, because I think I'd only read the older version, and I also saw a bit about that circularity model, which is very interesting. I also wish we would have heard from more people like Jill, for example, who's worked in public policy making, but I know you're too modest to.
No, it's just, no, but Claudia, it's just I never dreamed, and I'm older probably than Peter, that I would hear such exciting things from an economist's mouth. So thank you enormously, Peter.
Oh, well, you're welcome, Jill. No, you're way younger than me. Come on.
It's circularity anyway.
Well, thank you.
Do we want to do the very quickly the what have I learned, or what is the main question I'm getting from this toward the top?
Yeah. If I can start, maybe just to get myself out of the way. What I have learned is mostly from your response to Wei just now, that there's this kind of circularity in the argument of like the question of whether degrowth that impedes technological innovation or not, and the answer is no. It encourages the kind of technological innovation that is in line with our situation, with the limitations of our biosphere. So that's very interesting. Yeah, that's it for me. Maybe I will put Melina on the spot just for fun.
Yeah, surely. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting presentation and then discussion. I questioned lots of things. Surely, I think main thing I learned, or I guess we'll reflect more about, was the concept of sufficiency that is very insightful for me in this discussion. And also the question raised regarding the convergence and how we can reach some sort of balance globally. I think that's also very interesting for me. Thank you again very much for this talk.
So who's next, Claudia?
Jill, sorry, yes, Jill.
No, I just learned I had another question. I had a professor once who said, if the public will is engaged, the public purse is bottomless. What do you think about that, Peter?
Oh, yeah, as a little catchphrase. Well, we see that time and time again. Governments saying they don't have any money, and then something happens. And all of a sudden there's the money. And this is, I mentioned this thing called modern money theory. There's a woman called Stephanie Kelton in the US, an economist you might want to look at. Very very good economist, and she's written a book called The Deficit Myth. And she says, if a government owns its own bank, like Canada, the Canadian government owns the Bank of Canada, and the Bank of Canada can create money, which it can just by making computer entries. I'm not saying it doesn't have considerations, but it's nothing to stop it from doing that. Then where's this shortage of money? It comes from an old way of thinking that we all rely on gold, and there's only a certain amount of gold. So there's great ideas going around now that can help us in that respect.
Thank you, Jill. Jave?
I don't know how to encapsulate what I actually learned, because there's so much of these terminologies which are extraordinary, like overshoot and moral sentiment, sufficiency. And then it brings me all the way back to limits to growth, the Club of Rome, Buckminster Fuller, Spaceship Earth, and it just creates this enormous confluence of ideas. So thank you very much for stirring that thought.
Okay.
That is a true poet's response, Jave. Maybe Anita?
I learned what occurred to me as you were answering my question, which was, I very much like the way that you framed the inequivalence of economic growth and well-being, because I think from an economist's mouth, it actually sounded like something that might give hope to decision makers to actually make change. And so I wish that you would phrase that and disseminate it widely. And thank you very much.
Cool. Maybe now we can hear from more of the students. So, Zehri?
I think the most important lesson I learned today is essentially the concept of degrowth. Is like degrowth for me, it's more like a kind of economic terminology that we will never achieve in the future. But today I can see, like, finally I can see some hope. I feel like, yeah, it is not really a terminology anymore. It can be achieved, and we should work for it.
Yeah, converting everyone to degrowth today. Wei?
So the most I learned is my question about technology innovation, that I learned that degrowth is actually the change about physical dimension of economic, and also the regulation applied on the countries, whether by the government or the policies or by the private sector, and also fascinated by the discussion about the relationship between degrowth and inequality. So it's really amazing presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei. Chris?
Yeah, I am very glad that this meeting is recorded, because I would love to watch it again. A lot of the concepts I really encountered for the first time, so very grateful for the presentation. I also would like to revisit the graphs at the beginning. I would like to study them a bit further and try to understand exactly what the data represents. Yeah, basically, I still have a lot to learn on this topic. Economics is not my strongest field, so thank you for all the knowledge today.
Yeah, and thank you for your interest. Then we also have Maureen, who hasn't introduced herself at the beginning, but please, do you have anything that you take?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I joined a bit late. That's why I missed the presentation part. But thank you for the discussion and the presentation as well. One thing that just stuck in my head that I could tell was the comparison that you did about the concept of degrowth, that it shouldn't be taken as regression, but it's rather a positive concept. So yeah, that's one thing that I took from all the other stuff as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and hope to meet you at some other point, Maureen, too. Nakia, like all the other people are in the room, so please go ahead.
So wait.
I think one thing that really stood out for me was when you talked about wealth versus income. I think just having it presented that way, and I think when you said that if you just tackle income, that's going to take several years and really do need to go after wealth. because I think so often you just kind of hear about the income aspect of things. So that was very interesting for me, and I think in terms of a question, it's less of a question, but more, I think I'm really interested in the turning point model and to look at that. So, and thank you again for the presentation. It was really great.
So we also have Christian here.
Yeah, I think the thing that I took away the most was the idea of, you mentioned briefly that like we should maybe like think about where we want to be going, and then from that work backwards to like kind of get there and stuff like that. And I think that's kind of very positive and solution oriented.
In terms of what I learned, well, a lot, but mainly just a deeper understanding of degrowth that we had heard about, but I understand it a bit better now. And then my question would be, how do we change public opinion on growth versus sufficiency? It's a big question. But
There's?
That's also one of the questions, sorry.
There's?
Hello, I got here a bit late, but I really enjoyed the discussion. I don't have very much knowledge of economics, so it was really interesting to learn about these different dynamics. And one question I guess I have is like on the same topic of sufficiency. It seems so ingrained in our culture for people to pursue more and more material wealth, sort of to no end. So how could we get that cultural change going where people are no longer always going for bigger and more or developed societies?
Thank you. And as for me, I'm a bit like Christian. I think to me it was really, thank you, that was fascinating talk, really fascinating, rich and interesting and complex, which I love. No easy solution, which I think is really, to me, that exactly is what it is. But I was struck really by your comment, a bit like Christian. Like, first of all, you think of what kind of society you want, and then you think of the economic model. And I think we have it the other way around, which creates all sorts of problems. And my question is more of a technical one, and maybe one day you can come back and you can explain this to me. My question has to do with inflation, and I know how complex inflation is as a model. But I'd like to know whether inflation is unavoidable or not, because your model of stabilizing GDP is also, I was wondering whether that takes into account inflation or not, and if it's unavoidable. Anyway, the whole question of inflation for me is a bit mysterious, and I would love to hear more about it eventually.
Yeah. I mean, I do hope we can see Peter again. It would be amazing. Of course, no pressure on you, Peter. And thank you so much for making time, for joining us, for explaining so clearly and cleverly all these things and engaging with us in our questions. It was very enriching, truly. Yeah. So, yeah, we went a bit over time, but thank you, everyone, for...
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.